Many people ask me questions daily because of this YouTube channel, but I have to say there is one question that has been a constant for some time concerning Roman history, and that is the actual evidence of any uniform color, and most of the times in the case of red, for Roman tunics, as far as the Roman legionaries were concerned. Well, today, in this video, we will examine both historical references, archaeological references. We will discuss and we'll be reading Latin writers such as Vegetius, Levi, and many others. And then we will discuss how dyes for colors were created in the Mediterranean during classical Roman era. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. So, were the Romans wearing red tunics or not? Is there archaeological evidence? Is there literary evidence? Is there iconography to prove this? Well, I have had a look, as I always do before making videos. I just want to see what the general thought or the mainstream discourse is about any certain or given topic that I choose. And I noticed that there is quite a bit of confusion, because there are people who strongly support this idea of Romans wearing red, and then there are people who try to debunk it, trying to bring up as much evidence as they possibly can. Now, while some of the things that I have read are actually true and based on real historical evidence, there are many things that are complete nonsense. So in this video we'll be, yes, presenting some evidence, or at least the sort of evidence that I could find myself. But then ultimately, although I will share with you my own personal conclusion, I would like you to keep one thing in mind. With antiquity, there is no clear consensus. So you yourselves will have to make your own mind based on the sort of data that I will share with you today. Okay, so the first argument for those who back the idea of Romans wearing red is that, yes, red is the color of Mars, meaning that most of the times Mars is clad in red, and therefore, since the Romans consider themselves to be the sons of Mars, and considering the whole martial idea behind troops and legionaries, and red being the color of blood, and red being a very strong color from a psychological point of view for the sort of psychological impact that troops wearing uniform red, that sort of idea is what a lot of people bring forth. Still, such choice would be met by economical and financial problems. So before we can actually consider this valuable, we need to see how expensive would it be for the Romans to dye their tunics red. And thus we would have to see how such form of expenses would meet the economical structure of the Roman imperial and republican war machina. Having said this though, I did find quite a lot of people who are against the concept of Romans wearing red, who actually bring up this idea and they say to dye your tunics in red would have been too expensive in the Mediterranean at that time. But this statement is false. This statement is false. Why is it false? Because actually red was cheap. Scarlet red was expensive. Purple was expensive, but red was cheap. And we will get to the details of each single color, from indigo to all the different kinds of yellow. We will discuss how purple was made, what sort of blue would be expensive, or what sort of blue would not be expensive. Green. We will talk about all the colors, and I'll give you everything, all the details about it. But suffice to say for now, for the very beginning of this video, red was cheap. So this is in favor of those who support red used by the soldiers. People who tell you that red was expensive to produce for the Romans have never read a book about it in their lives. Another interesting point to bring up is that I noticed that in these forums that discussed these things, most of which are actually forums from video games, not really historians, or it's just that, you know, in a video game you see Romans wearing red, and then people ask about were they actually wearing red, and then you get lots of different people coming up with ideas. And one person actually mentioned the fact that he said that Julius Caesar, so Caesar, was reported to be wearing a red tunic, that he used it as a sign to during one of these campaigns, that it was about the moment he just put it on top of his tent to signal to his men that they should have been ready for battle. Again, another false information, so please be careful with these forums, because there are people who don't know what they're talking about. How can I prove that that's false? Because I'm going to read the exact passage for you from Polybius, because of course they never give bibliography, they never tell you who said what and where they read this. It's Polybius, but let me read it to you. Caesar, therefore, after saying that the expected day had come on which they would fight against men and not against want and hunger, quickly ordered the purple tunic to be hung up in front of his tent, that being the Roman signal for battle. Purple, not red. So Caesar was wearing purple. Does this mean that the entire army was wearing purple? Absolutely not, because you have to consider, first of all, when is this? We're in the 1st century and BC. And again, we need to consider this one thing. Again, I'll go into details later on in the video about dyeing and dyes and how they were produced and all the plants and the botany. Purple was the most expensive color to produce. Most of the times only emperors could afford it. At one point there were perhaps other people, like very rich merchants, who started to wanted to wear purple, and they were discouraged from doing so, and then they were actually prohibited from doing so. So that purple became only the color for the emperors. But only a general and then as an emperor could afford to buy a purple tunic. We will see why later on in the video. But we should not expect the common soldiers to wear purple. We should not expect even the centurions or even the commanding centurions, the superior centurions, to wear purple. We do have an interesting fresco in Pompeii called Judgment of Solomon, which shows a soldier with a red tunic, but it also shows 2 soldiers with white tunics. And this is already when the truth starts to unfold. This is when things start to become the way I think they were. What this helps us understand is that most likely, and then we'll find other proof of this, but most likely there was no uniform. We should not imagine the Roman soldiers, whether it be Republican times, whether it be Imperial times, to be wearing a uniform, all the same color. That is not a concept that was present at the time. And we should be quite familiar with this, because it's the same thing not only for tunics, but also for armor. Now, I'm wearing a lorica segmentata now, okay? So this is clearly imperial times, right? But even in imperial times, when lorica segmentata had been invented, we shouldn't imagine a full legion of people, of soldiers wearing all lorica segmentata. No, most likely there were soldiers with segmentata or laminata, soldiers with hamata, soldiers with quamata, plate, mail, and scale. Each soldier could wear the armor that he could afford. Not all armors would have the same price, and we know for a fact that some soldiers would be allowed to use the sort of armor that was handed down to them by their family members. So not all soldiers would always be wearing the ultimate, top-notch, highest sort of armor that was available, because that would have been the most expensive. Some soldiers would just get the sort of armor that perhaps their father used 10 years before, 20 years before, or that it was produced even 30 years before that. And we do know that some Roman soldiers at the beginning of their career would actually buy second-hand armors used by soldiers who had finished their service. For as long as the armor was functional, that was fine, and probably that would have been the same for the sort of helmets that they were using. We shouldn't imagine the entire legion wearing the same color of tunics, and probably considering that a legionary would receive a lot of new clothing every year, and considering that a legionary would have many tunics, most likely he would have had perhaps some red tunics, some white tunics. And in order for us to understand what colors could be more probable than others, then we do need to not only to see iconography, just like we did now, 2 soldiers in white, 1 soldier in red, but we should also see the prices and expenses of each single color to dye. We do have mentions again. Pliny mentions crimson as a dye for officer's cloak. So that's a possibility, crimson, but officers. But as far as blue is concerned, not navy blue, but just blue, simple blue, we do have some interesting information from Vegetius, Roman writer. You know, one of my favorite. And let me say something very briefly as far as Vegetius is concerned, because you know that I often quote Vegetius because I have read the entire De Re Militari. Now, some people have told me you shouldn't read Vegetius. He's not a good source as far as the Roman legionaries are concerned, because he was not in the military himself. But excuse me, let me defend Vegetius very quickly, because I consider him to be a reliable source. Now, let's say that you are not in the military, okay? But I'll show you this, which is a summer Italian Navy uniform, and this, which is the winter Italian Navy uniform. Do you need to be a general in the military, in the army, to actually be able to say and write that Italian Navy in summer wears all white, whereas Italian Navy in winter, they actually keep the white hat, but they don't wear white anymore because they wear blue? I don't think you do. And then you could say, yeah, you could say, well, does he know about training if he wasn't in the army? Well, I don't think it would be that difficult for a Roman writer of his level to actually invite, I'm not saying a general, but I could even invite a centurion, okay? You have a former friend who was a former centurion, 30 years in the legions, you know, have dinner together and ask him a few questions and write it down. And that's what I think he did, to be honest. I think it did have to do a lot with actual real soldiers. So I don't see any problems at all in the validity of what Vegetius says. So Vegetius tells us this: rowers, sailors, and naval soldiers wore blue tunics. So this already shows us there's at least some corps or some areas of the army wore blue, namely those that had to do with naval forces and the navy at the time. I'm going to read to you now some interesting information. First of all, one of Martial epigrams mentions, and I'm going to use classical Latin pronunciation now, Roma magis fuscis vestitur, Gallia rufis et placet hic pueris militibusque colos. Rome rather clads itself in dark colours, Gaul in red, and this colour boys and soldiers also like. From Plutarch we read, in Life of Fabius Maximus, but Terentius, insisting on his right to command a day in turn, and then encamping over against Hannibal by the river Aufidus and the town called Cannae, at break of day put out the signal for battle, a scarlet tunic displayed above the general's tent. I'm going to skip Isidore of Sevilla because it's not a very reliable source, but if we read Historia Augusta, we will read that red colour was that of Roman leaders. Okay, let's comment this. So what do we learn? First of all, we learned the soldiers liked red, and the rest of Rome mostly wore dark colours, although we don't know what colours. It could have been dark red, it could have been dark brown, and there are lots of possibilities. But soldiers liked red. Does this mean, is this a proof that all soldiers wore red? No, but it is a proof that some did. And then we do need to classify to distinguish red from scarlet, because I would say that only high commanding officers would wear scarlet. Scarlet is expensive, but it could be that other soldiers would be wearing red. And we do have something else about this. Let me read it to you. We do have reports of soldiers on campaign wearing a red sagum. Please keep in mind the campaign is one thing, battle is another, however. Although we do have Egyptian portraits which show centurions in white tunics. Okay, so what do we learn from all this? We learn from all this that as far as iconography and Roman writers are concerned, we know some legionaries wore red, we know some officers wore red, and we know other legionaries wore white. Naval soldiers wore blue. Let me refer to you a good book and a good read if you really want to get more knowledge on this topic of Roman clothing. I suggest you to read Graham Summers' Roman Military Dress. Now we're going to move to the second part of this video where we will discuss how these dyes were made, and we will talk from the most expensive to the less expensive ones. Okay, so starting to talk about the clothing and how the colors were produced. A range of colors available for dyeing the materials and fabrics used by Romans or for Roman clothing changed. It increased as the Romans came into contact with many of the nations in the Western world. You have to consider that the Romans were not only a military nation, they were also great traders. And in fact, they even opened trade routes to China from where they obtained silk and other luxury materials. So how do you produce and how do you dye a tunic? The material that the tunic was made of was heated with the dye and occasionally additional elements, but other items were added to the dye to produce a variety of different colors. These included wine, salts, shells, fungus, vinegar, lentils, walnuts, insects, wild cucumber, barley, plants, malt, bark, roots, berries and flowers. Of course, for the main colors of a legion, we would have to imagine that the cheapest dyes would be used. In order for a dye to be cheap, it needed to be produced by cheap sources, meaning plentiful sources available to the Romans from the provinces in the Roman Empire. For shades of colors, they would be produced by adding various elements in order to create combination colors, for example orange. Moving from the most expensive to the less expensive, we've got purple. The color was produced by a very expensive dye called Tyrian purple, which originated in Tyre in Lebanon. The Phoenicians had monopoly of this purple dye. It was made by crushing thousands of seashells, the Mediterranean murex. It took 10,000 mollusks to make dye just for one toga. So we can easily say that such tunic or toga would be worth more than its weight in gold. Saffron yellow, a rich color of yellow, which was produced by using an expensive dye. The yellow saffron dye comes from the bright red stigmas of the saffron crocus, Crocus sativus, which was found in areas of the Mediterranean, including Spain and Greece. When we talk about Crocus sativus stigmas, we're talking about the female part of the flower, and the saffron dye was produced by dyeing these and boiling other plants to produce this sort of very vibrant yellow. Indigo. Indigo was also a very expensive dye. This rich color was worn by the wealthy and should not be confused with the color blue, which was produced by using cheap blue dye, which was obtained from plants such as the woad. For the indigo color, the source will be, of course, indigo plants. Indigofera tinctoria. This dye would be imported from India at great expense. Process of production would include fermentation, filtering, and finally dyeing into cakes of dye. Crimson. Here is another expensive color for the Roman clothing. The kermes, or crimson, was obtained from the dried bodies of female insects. To be specific, the kermes vermilio plancon and the kermes ilicis. These insects were found in southern Europe on the small evergreen kermes oak, Quercus coccifera. This sort of color and this sort of dye dates back to the ancient Egyptians. It was produced by the process of drying the bodies of these insects and then fermentation. Yellow. Yellow is a common color for the Romans. It was produced by using cheap dye, which was produced from weld. Weld is a European plant. The Latin name would be Reseda uteola, which was cultivated for the very purpose of creating a source of cheap yellow dye. Green. Another very common color, and rather cheap, was produced by using lichen. Now, lichen was a plant of the division of lichenes, which occur as crusty patches or brushy growth on tree trunks, and sometimes even on rocks or bare ground. Finally, red, pink, brown and orange. Red was rather cheap to produce, and it was produced using madder. Madder was a European herb, Rubia tinctorum, and the root of this plant was used to create the color for the tunics. The same root was used to produce dyes or shades of red based on colors including orange, russet, pink, coral, light red, dark red, russet and brown. All of these being rather cheap. Blue is another common color and cheap to create. As I said, it was created using woad, although sometimes even very cheap versions of yellow for tunics were also created using woad. Woad is a European herb, Isatis tinctoria, which belongs to the mustard family, grown for the blue dye stuff yielded by its leaves. The process to create this dye was to dry the leaves, crush them, and then have them composted with manure. Dye was then produced through fermentation over several weeks. Alright, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. So I will see you tomorrow, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Valete!